I grew up in a very entrepreneurial family. Both my parents owned restaurants. That doesn't mean that you're talking about money at the dinner table. It's not about dollars and cents necessarily. It's here's a problem. What would you do as a kid? That's what running a business is, just kind of managing crap that happens. My brother and I, we would play a game, it's called Take Apart. And we would find trash on the street, you know, an old VCR or stereo and just take it apart. But it's funny, we called it Take Apart. It wasn't put together, it wasn't a fix, it wasn't a do anything with. It was always take apart. So there was this sort of diagnostic lean to our curiosity.
How did your connection to the renewables sector emerge?
I studied electrical engineering and had a focus in renewable energy generation in college, but prior to that was in the mindset of starting a business in some way, shape, or form. And that could be selling t-shirts or categorizing books or organizing some event where we could sell tickets to and make money. I was always kind of off doing my schemes and then off building things. And I never really put those together for quite some time, actually.
Let's talk about Pvilion.
Pvilion, what we do fundamentally is we integrate solar cells with fabrics. So that could be a bag or a backpack, a tent, a canopy, an awning, or a stadium roof or an amphitheater or an athletic facility. So any opportunity for fabric to get hit by the sun is an opportunity to generate electricity.
You come from a family that said, how do we become more? How do we build something in its essence? How are you embodying that for your journey with Pvilion going forwards? Hello and welcome back to CleanTalk, a podcast shining a spotlight on inspiring professionals and organizations within the clean tech and renewable sector. I'm Luke. I run Harmer Visuals, a video agency working to enable climate transformation through data-driven storytelling. Today, I'm joined by Colin Touhey from Pvilion. We're going to be talking about his products and services, as well as his entrepreneurial journey, which takes us back, in fact, to the States, just like in season 1. So I'm very excited to hear about this. Colin, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a pleasure.
Colin, tell me what I need to know about you and your upbringing.
I've always been a tinkerer. So I love making things, breaking things, taking things apart. I'm not particularly good at putting them back together once they've been taken apart, as my family and friends can attest to. But I studied engineering, electrical engineering, and had a focus in renewable energy generation in college. But I think prior to that, I definitely was in the mindset of starting a business in some way, shape, or form. And that could be selling t-shirts or categorizing books or organizing some event where we could sell tickets to and make money. Basically, any way to make money and start a business was something I was interested in. And that was aside from a sort of engineering and tinkering background. And I never really thought of those two things as working together.
Interesting. Okay.
Until a little bit later in life. So I was always kind of off doing my schemes and then off building things. And I never really put those together for quite some time, actually.
So that interest in taking things apart, how early does that go back?
Oh, very, very early. I mean, my brother and I, we would play a game that was just, it was called Take Apart. And we would find trash on the street, you know, an old VCR or stereo and just take it apart. But it's funny, we called it Take Apart. It wasn't put together. It wasn't a fix. It wasn't a do anything with. It was always taking apart. So there was this sort of diagnostic lean to our curiosity.
Interesting.
That it was really, let's just dissect some piece of technology and try to understand what's going on. And most of the time it just ended up with junk on the floor of our house and, you know, everyone stepping on it.
Talk me through education. You had these interests. Did they surface in what you were pursuing when you got the opportunity to kind of be a bit more selective about what you were studying?
No, not actually. It kind of happened by accident. I've always been more interested in math and science, physics, chemistry than reading and writing and history. My entire life, I never really thought of that as something useful. And even in high school, it was more an intellectual curiosity in math and science, not a functional one, not actually thinking about it being able to turn into a career. But in college, I had one course. It was actually an art course. And the first class of that course, the professor said, you know, half of you are going to leave after this class. And basically it was because he was such an asshole. And halfway through the class, he said, okay, everyone leave, go get lunch. And half of you are going to come back and half of you aren't. And I said, well, there's no way I'm coming back. I hate this guy. but I don't know what to do and I don't know where to go. So I was honestly just wandering around the campus and stumbled upon the engineering building. And I walked into the engineering building on campus. And so this is a liberal arts college, which means you don't have to apply to different,
Right,
different
okay.
college or different programs, right? So it might be a little bit different.
Okay.
So I was in my second year at university, basically, which is late to make these decisions. And there was a professor who came in and welcomed me with open arms and said, "Oh, who are you? What are you doing?" And I said, "I don't know. I don't have class right now. I'm just wandering around." And he said, "Come on in, come on in, come on in." And he was an electrical engineering professor. They were focusing on binary logic and Boolean logic and sort of the what I would say was more sort of the early intellectual side of the engineering curriculum, where it's very logic based and kind of curiosity based, not necessarily playing with things with your hands. And then I realized, whoa, you can actually apply this to computers. And then basically that's what computers are. So I didn't know that at the time, but that got me started, and I pretty much never looked back.
That opened the door to the tinkerer and let him out in the study environment, so to speak. Your other interest. When did this surface? Have you always been trying to like create value?
Yeah. I mean, to a certain extent, I don't know if I'm ever really do a very good job of it, but I try. I grew up in a very entrepreneurial family.
Can I just stop you there? That's interesting because not a lot of people say that. The kind of narrative tends to be my mum and dad were doctors or lawyers, or the other side, which is I grew up in a working class family and then I went the entrepreneurial route. So to hear someone say, what does an entrepreneurial family look like?
Oh, that's really interesting. Both my parents owned restaurants when I was growing up. They were in real estate and restaurants, and various other businesses throughout our childhood. And I think what that looks like is a very kind of intellectual decision-making process every day on a nightly basis. What are you talking about at the dinner table? That doesn't mean that you're talking about money. It's not about dollars and cents necessarily. It's here's a problem. I have this problem. I have a tenant who won't move out. What would you do as a kid? Oh, you kick him out. Well, where are they going to live? Is that legal? Can you do that? Should you do that? Well, they're going to pay their rent at some point. So maybe you have these conversations. A restaurant is going really well, and should we open a second one? Of course. Well, where do you get the money for, as a kid? Of course, open more restaurants. That's so great. Where do you get the money for that? Who's going to run that? You need a second in command who can run multiple restaurants. Well, that's a totally different conversation than being a self-employed entrepreneur. Well, that's building a team. How do you find that team? Do you build that team from the ground up, from someone who started as a waiter or waitress and then became a host and then became a manager? Or do you hire someone who this is what they do? They run multiple restaurants. So at 5-10 years old, we're having these conversations at home.
Wow.
And it didn't feel ever like a business conversation. That's why I don't think of myself as necessarily a business person. It's more just kind of managing crap that happens. That's I think what running a business is just all the crap that happens.
Problem solving.
I think, problem solving and that there's really no problem too big to overcome with kind of intellectual curiosity and a sort of Socratic method of discovery, and a way of really just being able to get at something.
So those dinner time conversations sounded like they revolved around a reflex in your parents to say, how do we? Rather than anything else, really.
Yeah.
Trying to unpick that and kind of, I guess, like compare that against the slate of maybe other households. What do you think was different in that?
It's interesting you say doctor and lawyer, because I think that's the sort of traditional path. If you have your parents are two doctors, and then they say, well, the field that you're going into, you're going to go to medical school and you're going to become a doctor. You have two parents who are lawyers. Oh, you're going to go to law school and you're going to become a lawyer. I don't think that was ingrained in me forcefully.
Sure.
But it wasn't a coincidence. My brother runs his own business as well.
Okay.
So it was never work for anyone, never work for anyone, never work for anyone, always work for yourself.
That was what came through.
Yeah. That was sort of like, and do I feel any of the sort of the same emotions that a kid who grew up with two parents who are doctors and forces them to go to med school? Probably a little bit, but not because I think running your own business is very free-formed. It never really feels forced.
No.
Because if it is forced, you're just not going to be able to do it.
It is ironic though, isn't it? Because the journey of starting a business as you kind of laid down, was that you're going to set the ground rules and you're going to be the one in charge. But then ironically, what happens is, and not that it's a bad experience because it's a different paradigm, but like you just end up with multiple bosses, and you end up with, your clients being duplications of who you might have had as an employee or working for someone else. What's your take on, I guess, that outplaying? Do you think that there are caveats to the self-run route?
I have many bosses, and those bosses are way worse than having one that you report to who tells you do this thing today, in my opinion. And that boss is a client on the other side of the world. That boss is a lawyer who just gave you bad news that you have to go figure out some problem. That boss is a problem with a 19-year-old intern or an HR issue, or your landlord who says there's an issue with your office, or, in many ways, the boss is the person installing the heating and air conditioning in our office because no one can function. So is that someone I report to? No, but is that person my boss and running my life? Yeah. I mean, basically I can't do anything without that person installing the heating and air conditioning in our office. So they technically work for us, but it doesn't feel like that most days.
Sure. How did your connection to the renewables sector emerge, or your interest in it?
That was sort of by accident. I studied electrical engineering, as I said, and there were kind of two routes to go down, and it felt like 99% of the people in my program were going down more of the computer engineering, electrical engineering side, not the power electronics side. Okay. And I said, wait a minute, we're talking about transistors and, microcontrollers and programming, and everyone was really into the sort of nitty gritty of the robotics. And I was really interested in kind of reversing that and saying, well, how do you generate electricity here?
Right.
And I think it was a time just like it is today. But it was a time, in the kind of early 2000s where renewable energy was basically, the concept was, let's harness energy from any source we can.
Interesting.
And there were NASA programs and Department of Energy programs, and solar wasn't what it is today. Wind wasn't what it is today. And so the excitement of taking the natural environment and converting it to electricity, basically there were an infinite number of ways of doing that. And now I think the market has driven certain technologies to be better than others. And there are new, cool, innovative technologies all the time, but it felt like when I was really getting into it and learning about it, some crazy tidal technology was as viable as solar on rooftops.
Right.
And it just felt like every option on the table was an equal option on the table. Now, you kind of know, all right, well, 28% is going to come from solar and 14% from wind. The market has driven it into a really great place, but from a technological standpoint, where I was 20 years ago, I think it was a much broader intellectual space.
Interesting.
It's not narrow now, but the market has done its thing.
Yeah, the spirit that kind of like drives the renewable sector of it, like innovation and disruption. Do you think it's dried up more than it should have done, or more than is ideal?
I think that the disruption in the next few years in the renewable space is not going to be technological disruption. It's going to be business model, financial, and regulatory disruption. So, it's a new solar cell is not going to take over in the next 5 years, like maybe in 20 years or 50 years. But if you're in solar, you're buying solar cells, they're probably monocrystalline 99% of the time, and you're putting them in a field or on a roof, and that's going to be the vast majority of the market. The innovation is going to come in. What's the software to manage that? How are you storing that in batteries? The battery technology isn't going to have a quantum leap. And this is, I'm not trying to be pessimistic. Okay. I hope it does. I think it could. But I think that the opportunity and the excitement is in business model innovation. Look, the technologies work. They work. Like, that's amazing. It took us so far to come to this point where EVs are really good, lithium ion batteries are really good, solar panels are really good, wind turbines are really good. heat pumps are really good. Okay, technology's there. How do we connect this? How do we integrate this? How do we build the software systems? How do we sell more of this? How do we regulate this so it doesn't grow too fast in certain markets?
Sure.
I think that's where the innovation is.
That's fascinating. Let's talk about Pvilion.
Yeah.
We connected, ironically, in New York. We're here in Glasgow today, but
Only a few thousand miles away.
the conversation first started in the States. Tell me about Pvilion, the role it plays, what its foundation was, and kind of its vision, mission, and values.
Yeah. So Pvilion, what we do fundamentally is we integrate solar cells with fabrics. So we build products that generate electricity that are based in fabric. So that could be a bag or a backpack, a tent, a canopy, an awning, or a stadium roof or an amphitheater or an athletic facility. So really any opportunity for fabric to get hit by the sun is an opportunity to generate electricity out of that fabric. So that's the fundamental core technology of Pvilion. We think of ourselves a little bit as kind of an Intel, where you kind of have Intel inside, like it's powered by Pvilion. And that could be a barn, that could be an industrial shed, that could be a geotextile, that could be clothing, whatever it is, it's sort of Pvilion technology. Where we've come after all these years is we really have been focusing on a few main verticals or few main markets. One in particular is temporary shelters, so basically solar powered tents with batteries, heating, air conditioning, lighting, communications, laptops, Wi-Fi, etc. And then the architectural space and temporary space would be more like canopies, awnings, car parks, outdoor canopy over a garden, or a bus shelter when you're waiting for the bus, that kind of thing.
Amazing. That's quite niche, fabrics integrated with solar solutions. How did that come about?
Yeah, so I have two partners, Robert Lerner and Todd Dowland, and they have been in the tent industry since the 1970s, 1980s. So their background is in tent engineering and design. A little bit of a history lesson in the tent world. Prior to the 1970s, 1980s, when you were building a tent, it was very much a artisanal process passed down generation to generation. It wasn't a computational analysis.
Okay.
Will this hold up? When you start to get into big stadium roofs in the Munich Olympic Stadium and huge spans out of fabric, you have to do computational analysis. And so there's a whole cottage industry actually born out of the UK.
Wow.
A lot of it in Bath, sort of tensile structure industry where you have these really interesting doubly curved surfaces. And my partners basically fell in love with that as architects, right? As designers and engineers, but mostly on the design side. How do these things look? How do they function? And they ran a business for a couple decades prior to me being involved at all. And they were integrating technology into fabric structures. They were building tents for the army. They were building camping tents, event tents for parties and weddings. If you've had a party in a big white tent, chances are that it's the evolution of a product they designed in the 70s, 80s, 90s. There was a global firm and really a sort of big opportunity. At some point, they were asked to integrate solar cells into the tent to make a museum exhibit for the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. Basically, it was the future of energy. Oh, we're going to do an outdoor exhibit on the future. So why don't we make it a solar powered tent? I don't even know who came up with the idea. I think the client might have. But that was where it was born. And so fast forward a few years and I joined the team as an electrical engineer. So I came in on the engineering side. They were on the tent design side, but they didn't have the technical expertise on the solar itself.
Sure.
So I came in and I sort of reworked the concept of the product, and there were some sort of corporate shakeups going on within that business. And we said, let's start a totally new entity where we're only focusing on solar powered tents. That's our main focus. We're not a tent company and one little thing we do is a solar powered tent. This is what we do. So that's when we started Pvilion, and it was about 13 years ago now.
Was that a hard transition for them? You said they had quite the scope of a background in the tent industry. For them to suddenly hone in on that niche, was there any tension in that at all?
No, I think they were really excited about it. I think the future at the time was not tents. The future was renewables. I mean, look at where we are now. Like, which industry has grown exponentially in the last 14 years? It's not camping tents.
Sure. Talk me through the early days of that business from a logistical standpoint of how the business was run before, the assets you had and the processes, to then transitioning to this new domain. Did it take a lot of work to set up, or was it something you could kind of translate different models and systems to apply in a new way?
Well, everyone has a different sort of story about how any business starts. And I think it's important to understand that there's no one way to do it. And we have a pretty unique journey. Basically, we worked for, this was their company, but the three of us sort of were the engineering design team of a company. And we thought that there could be innovation in the space, both from a technological perspective and from a market penetration perspective, that was not being pursued or respected by the company as a whole. And we were banging down the door saying, we should go after this market, and that market, and we should modify the technology in these three ways. And the company just didn't want to do that. And so we thought, well, what if we did it ourselves? And so we basically went to the board and we said, we're sick of this. You don't really care about design and engineering, and you don't care about the markets we're interested in. Can we just go off and do our own thing? Because you're saying you don't care about these markets and you don't care about the technologies we're interested in. So it wouldn't be competitive at all, right? And they said, yeah, sure. As long as you aren't focused on the thing that we're doing now, you guys can go and start your own thing, which meant we had the IP of the old company and we had the name to a certain extent, in that my partners have the pedigree and they were still kind of on the board there. So when we started our business, we didn't need any money. We had a couple clients who had been asking for the products and services that we were kind of eager to get out there.
Yeah.
And so basically in the literal same office, it was kind of an office about a quarter the size, but it felt the same, kind of white room with 3 desks.
Yep.
Literally the same office, we started that company. So it took a couple $1,000s of legal fees and building a website, and the company was stood up. Now, a year later, the initial company went out of business because they didn't advance their technology and they weren't looking at new markets.
This is the previous company?
Yeah, the previous company.
Wow.
So now all of a sudden, not only do we own the IP and there's no competitors, but we're free to enter the markets that they were in already, which ironically, kind of coming full circle a decade later, a big part of that is the military business and the US government business. So there's visual signal, there's audio signal, and then there's thermal signal. With solar, you can get rid of a lot of those. So you can basically have silence, complete silence. A lot of our customers on military bases and in humanitarian aid settings, when they come and see our product, they walk inside and they don't understand what's going on. Oh, it's not working, it's not running, because they're used to walking into a big tent and it's as loud as all hell because you have crazy loud air conditioning, you have crazy loud generators. So the noise is a big part of what we do. The initial company, they were going after the US Army with one product.
Yeah.
The Army is a massive market that takes a decade to tap into, and the product wasn't good. And we said, you need to go after other markets that are lower hanging fruit with a more advanced product. Right. Actually, in fact, a cheaper, better product, not the Army version of it. And so they were basically sitting around waiting for $1 billion contract that wasn't going to happen with a product that wasn't very good. So we said, okay, we're not going to sit around and wait for this. Why don't we sell something to the commercial market? So we basically took that technology and we brought it into the commercial market. That was the specifics of it.
Was there any bitterness after that?
No, there really wasn't. Ironically, our first customer was them, because they realized they had no design engineering expertise. So they called us and they said, can you consult for us and kind of maybe design some new products? I said, yeah, sure. That'll be, $5,000, $10,000 a month. And that paid our rent for, 9 months.
That seems like a really good deal in terms of your trajectory as a group of people.
It's incredible. But I also think that a lot more people can do that than you think. I mean, granted, that we've had incredible luck. We've had an incredible support system. We've had family and friends who have supported us. But, I heard a phrase, intrapreneurship, which is kind of cheesy. I didn't ever think of it until I heard this phrase, but, you can kind of start a thing within a company with the company's resources. And when that company says, we don't really care about this.
Intrapreneurship.
Yeah.
I'm getting it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, sometimes it's basically starting a division of your own company.
Right.
If an employee came to me and said, hey, I'm really eager to start this thing and it's going to take $5,000 and I want to work on it 10 hours a week. And I think it's a new product that we need and there's a market for. If I said no to that, then they might go off and do their own thing.
Sure.
So I might say yes to that. And it might be a big part of our business, or there's a certain point a year in where we basically mutually say, look, it's not working for us. If you want to go and do it, go for it. I think there are a lot more companies and organizations that are willing to allow that kind of thing. And it's a way of, in some ways, as a young person or an entrepreneur who wants to go off and start their own thing, you can kind of start your own thing with other people's resources before you kind of, go off on your own.
How can organizations foster a culture where entrepreneurship is encouraged in the right manner for their own company?
Well, I can't say I do a great job of it. So I'm not the best, but I like to think that people can come to me or to anyone in our company with an idea and a vision, and that it's not going to be shot down immediately. Okay. Right. It's, hey, I have an idea for a product improvement. I'm not going to say, okay, here's $1 million, go and do it. But if they keep following up and keep saying, hey, what about this? What about this? What about this? You gotta listen. Yeah, I think in order to foster an environment of entrepreneurship or innovation, you kind of have to have a long leash to a certain extent, is let team members do their thing and do it how they want to do it, because then they create an environment on their own, amongst colleagues of innovation and coming up with new ideas. I like to think that we do an okay job of listening. When someone comes to us with a completely half-baked scheme and they say, oh, I want to do this new thing, I don't think that's a very good case. I like to think that we allow an environment where if you come to us with a request and if you come to us with a well thought out plan of how I'm going to do something, then we're probably going to let you start to do that. And that happens.
We've touched on the markets that you target. So the military is a big one. There are others that I think you mentioned, such as aid organizations and the commercial space. Do you want to walk us through that a little bit further?
Yeah, so I think we would separate our products into, generally speaking, temporary and permanent. Permanent would be an amphitheater over a stage at a band shell. It's going to be permanently there. It's going to be engineered for complete wind load, hurricanes, snow. That's a building, a bus stop where it's engineered for 150 mile an hour winds, and that is a permanent structure. Within that category, that could be a municipal project, that could be a government project, that could be a private entity. We have products at Google's headquarters in California where they're basically, canopies scattered around the campus. Those are permanent structures. Yep. They can be grid tied and feeding back into the grid, or they can be off grid, but they're still permanently there. Yeah. And that's one group of the market. So that would be, we'd work with architects, landscape architects, cities, states, governments, Department of Transportation. We built a bridge over a road. We built a bridge over a road that was solar powered. And so that's working with the Department of Transportation. And then the opposite side is the more temporary side. So that's, kind of the humanitarian aid, military world. And then the event world, which is a big one. So you look at music festivals, film, solar powered shelter is really critical. Yep. Because they're trying to get off of diesel generators. And then you have farmers markets and pop-up events and camping and glamping and all sorts of environments where it's really temporary.
If there's a renewable technology sitting in a cupboard somewhere, it doesn't do a lot to change the narrative on the use of the tech and its integration in our everyday lives. I'm assuming that the event space is the one where there's the most opportunity for this technology to really get seen by the everyday person. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I also think when we look at sort of disrupting the temporary generator space, the simplest thing is that you're replacing the generator with a bank of batteries that are portable. No one gives a shit because that's sitting behind the stage. But when you say, oh yeah, by the way, that's actually powered by the stage, which has solar all over it,
right.
Or you're having an event, in a big white tent, and that's covered in solar cells and that's powering it. That's a completely different thing. And there are two elements. There's the virtue signaling and there's the functionality. And I think those two go hand in hand. You can add 2 solar panels to a tent and do the virtue signaling thing, or you can coat an entire surface with solar and have it be completely off grid and use no fuel. And so ironically, and I think this is where the balance of government work and commercial work is important, is that the government work, they couldn't care less about the virtue signaling. It's 100% function. We need to use less fuel, down to no fuel at all. And the event side, they already use fuel and they're okay with it, but the market is saying, hey, I don't want to have an event with a diesel generator because it looks bad.
Right. Yeah.
So the technology is being innovated on one front and the market's being pulled on another front. And those two things are actually getting closer and closer together, right? Because you have the government saying, we want to use less fuel for visibility reasons as well. And then you have the event world saying, well, fuel's actually really expensive. We want to cut down on it. So in some ways, these markets used to be here and here, and now they're kind of getting closer and closer.
Whose role is it to advocate for the technology being used? And again, when I say virtue signal, I don't mean the sort of shallow idea of virtue signaling, but the idea of promoting good values. In the instances and supply chains you've worked within the event sector, whose responsibility is it to kind of carry that brand image and promote it?
Well, we could have an entire podcast on the event industry and sort of sustainability within the event industry. I'm sure there is a podcast on that. I think it's very complicated because the supply chain there is not just one of materials to factories to manufacturing to distribution to selling. Really, the supply chain there is a rental model. So when you have an event for the weekend, you're probably not owning any of the stuff.
Sure.
You have a production company that's managing that event, and that production company is doing solicitations to rental companies who are then renting the tent to a production company who's renting it to the client or who's managing a client. And often the client is an event planner and the event planner has a client who's, Barclays Bank or something.
Sure.
And so it's so many steps down the food chain, but then it's the Barclays sustainability department that says, what the hell can we do to make our event more sustainable? And it goes all the way down the chain to the people holding the inventory of the generators and tents. And if you're one of the people holding the inventory, when you say, oh, actually we have solar powered tents with battery packs that's going to power your entire event, then that makes its way up the food chain. So it's very convoluted and it's a really tough space to be in. So you have to figure out where your niche is, right? Yep. Are you going to be renting this equipment and you hold an inventory and rent it out to individual events? Are you going to be a factory in China that's manufacturing fabric? Are you going to be somewhere in between? It's a tough challenge to figure out where you fit in that food chain.
Colin, what are your plans both individually and corporately for the future? Where are you moving more into? Where are you growing? You come from a family that said, how do we? And how do we kind of become more? How do we build something in its essence? How are you embodying that for your personal and corporate journey with Pvilion going forwards?
With our corporate journey, what we're trying to do is do fewer project-based customer projects trying to do fewer project-based businesses and more product-based business. Basically, every client wants something custom. And so what we've done is we've built out a modular family of products that is really more of a Lego kit that you can piece together. So you can have this many batteries and this much power and this much solar and this size tent, and it can be this color. And it's more of custom configurations of a product line. And that's taken us a couple years to really get to, which means that business can be a little more self-sufficient from a design, engineering, technology standpoint. It's more about the sales and marketing and development of it. So I think spinning off and rolling the product business into sort of a self-sufficient entity is really important, while we have the intellectual problem solving, research and development, product development side. So we kind of have these two loops. You have your research side and your development side, and then that spins off into product side. And I think we're just now having our first successful, serious closed loop product entities that now maybe they could be spun off into completely different businesses. I'm not saying that's going to happen anytime soon, but it's like you have to put on a completely different hat to sell 1,000 of something and basically just churn that out than you do to create something from a sketch on a napkin. So I think that's a big part of it.
The long-term result of all of this change is going to mean, I suppose, more efficiency and scale.
Yeah, I think more efficiency and scale, and I think us doing more of what we do best. And I think what we do best is we innovate products, turn them into something new, and then churn them out to a repeatable, manufacturable sort of product line.
Yep. And
once it's in the sort of repeatable, manufacturable product line, is that something that we do in-house? We just opened a new factory in Brooklyn, and it's a wonderful facility. Are we going to do $100 million of business manufacturing out of the most expensive real estate in the world? Probably not. So maybe that ends up being pilot production lines where we get something to a certain scale and we pass it off. So right. I think where we do our work best is in the kind of research and development, product development, and then small scale pilot production lines until we can hand it off.
It's time for Quickfire Curiosity, which is our nice little personal trivia section to end the show. Would you consider yourself a futurist?
Honestly, no, I don't think I'd consider myself a futurist because I'm a lot more interested in what's doable now, and we will create the trajectory for the future now. So I'm a lot more interested in the technology that's available today and how we can piece those things together and tinker around to actually turn something into the future.
I would say that is futurism. How would you define futurism?
Well, I think of futurism as something where I can actually project and close my eyes and envision what's going to happen in 20 or 50 years. I'd rather start from today and create a trajectory, and that's sort of your dead reckoning compass to see where you're headed, but I'm not going to really project exactly what's happening at the end.
If you could go back to your younger self, just before you arrived at the engineering space at the university, you've meandered off for that lunchtime break after the very bitter tutor had sort of said, half of you aren't coming back. You spawn in on the campus during that little meander around. You see your younger self. You've got 30 seconds. What advice do you give him?
I think there's a lot more to engineering than academic engineering than what you learn in university. I use some of the skills that I learned in university as an engineer, but it's really more about a mindset. So just remember the problem solving skills that you're learning and not the actual topics.
Okay. We've got lots of people listening into the show from a range of places in life, from early stage entrepreneurs to business people later in their career. What questions would you encourage them to ask themselves to identify opportunities that are best suited to them?
Is there someone who's willing to buy something that you're willing to create right now? Because in order to have a business in 5 years, you have to have a business in 4 years, which means you have to have a business in 3 years and 2 years and 1 year. So you need to figure out very quickly what someone is willing to buy now to afford to sell them the thing that you envision a few years from now. So find that value that you're adding today and sell that thing. And that could be you and consulting and making, $50 or $100 an hour so that you can afford to start this business. But you need to figure out how to sell something very short term and make money now.
Colin, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure. I wish we could have geeked out more on the technology itself, if I'm honest, but it's been thoroughly enjoyable. Thank you everybody for listening in to today's episode. We'll be back in just another week. Tune in again next Monday and we'll see you soon. Bye for now.